Listen, between YouTube and Facebook, people are clearly agitated and they're all over the map because so much is going on that just comes across as bonkers. It is bonkers and it's going to get worse. So, before I get into the specific questions you asked today, I want to step back and give you a framework for thinking about the moment we're in. All right, and I'm going to take you way back. I'm going to take you all the way back to 1935 because in 1935 something dramatic happened to the United States government, and that was under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat. During the Great Depression, Congress passed and the president signed into law the Social Security Act. And what that did is it changed the relationship between individuals and the government. That is, the government took on a responsibility for making sure that the elderly and children and differently abled people and so on had some support. And what that did is it really reoriented the government in a pretty dramatic way. That is, you know, the elderly suddenly didn't necessarily have to worry about being on the street, or this actually came from somebody watching two elderly ladies eating out of a trash can. And if they still lived with their children, they would bring a paycheck, or a social security check into their families. So it reoriented the country in a fairly dramatic way. But some other things also happened under the New Deal. One of those was the idea that the government would try to treat everybody in America, all the men in America, similarly, and there were also gains for women as well. Now, that didn't actually happen. Certainly, Black Americans and Brown Americans, and certainly Indigenous Americans, were not treated the same as white men. But there was this devotion to that idea that that America's laws would once again, or would once be colorblind the way they had been designed to be after the Civil War. So you got that, but you also got the federal government beginning to invest in infrastructure, for example, in the Tennessee Valley Authority, in making sure that people had electricity, in making sure that people had access to decent roads. Now, that's going to take off after World War II, but what I'm trying to lay out here is the idea that government starts to be involved in the American society in a different way than it had been before. And it also, quite crucially, begins to regulate business. It begins to step in and say to business people, hey, you can't do anything you want. You can't do things like, for example, put your workers on a bus and drive them into the middle of the desert and push them off and make them make their way back to a town without any water to prove to them that they better do as you say. That actually happened in Arizona. So that mattered a lot. But what it also did is it was enormously popular. People really liked this government. It stabilized the country. It stabilized the economy, gave people a sense that they could work their way up. And the country, especially after World War II, when the United States is one of the few countries that hasn't been completely destroyed by that war, so the economy booms, it really convinces people that this is the kind of government we need. And it's called the liberal consensus. Liberal meaning the idea that in order for individuals to be able to have the opportunity to create their own futures, you need to have a government that makes sure they're not going to get squished by big business or by starvation, that they get educations, that they have access to health care, that there is a way to protect the individual, the libre, the individual person in a society. So there is this sense that this is the way America is going to be. And Americans since then, of all political parties, for an overwhelming majority of them, have liked that system. Now, they don't agree about what the laws should all look like or how much infrastructure there should be and so on. But they did agree that they liked that kind of a government. And many of them thought it wouldn't go anywhere, that this was here to stay. So when Democrats used to say, well, the Republicans are trying to take away Social Security, there was a lot of people saying, oh, that's just ridiculous. You're fear mongering. They'll never do that. Right. Okay, so what happens is that beginning in the 1930s, but really taking off in the 1950s, you have a group largely made up of wealthy businessmen because entrepreneurs like that system. They like that level playing field. But more established businessmen don't like it because they don't like the idea either of business regulation. That's what they really don't like. And they don't like the idea of the taxation that is required to do things like pay for roads and schools and hospitals. So they begin to argue that this system is a form of socialism. Remember, you've got the real fear after World War II of communism spreading across Asia and across from the USSR, from the Soviet Union. But they argue partly that it's socialism. They also make a big stand against the idea that it is being caused, this large government that provides these benefits for all Americans, is coddling Black people, brown people, and women. And that really takes off after the Brown, it takes off a little bit before that. It takes off as early as 1948 under President Truman, because he begins to desegregate the military, for example, and he puts together this committee of people to talk about how civil rights really matter in America. But it really takes off after 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, in which those people who object to business regulation and object to the idea of the taxes that do things like underpin a social safety net and infrastructure, that they don't want to pay those taxes. And they start to argue then that the whole point of there being this government that does all these things, is to funnel the tax dollars of hardworking Americans, defined usually as white men in the literature of the time, to undeserving people of color, Black America and Black Americans. Women are going to come in the late 1960s, 1970s. That idea that the government that is serving everybody is a reflection of the demands of undeserving, sort of un-American-ish people of color, and as I say later, women, really takes off after 1965 with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which guarantees that people of color can vote. And that law is going to get expanded later on with the demand that we provide ballots in a number of different languages, for example. Then in the 1960s and then into the 1970s, under Richard Nixon, those people who are objecting to that government for different reasons, and mind you, this is a drive-by of American history. I mean, I should stop and give you 10 hours on basically each sentence here. But there's the argument beginning in 1972, 71, 72, before Roe versus Wade, that women who want to work outside the home, known as women's libbers by those people who don't like them, are trying to destroy the American family and trying to insist on benefits from the federal government to give them benefits that they don't deserve, and that they want to use benefits for things like abortion. And this is where abortion starts to become a really big rallying cry for that reactionary right-wing movement, because it begins to pull into that Republican coalition that stands against business regulation religious traditionalists who really begin to talk about abortion not as having anything to do with fetuses, but rather with freeing women from traditional marriages and from traditional hierarchies. And that's going to be really key, because going into the 1970s, then you're going to see a re-emphasis or an emphasis on traditional hierarchies of race and hierarchies of gender, getting linked together to this idea of getting rid of that government that regulates business, provides a basic social safety net, promotes infrastructure, and protects civil rights, and also works in the international level to create all these alliances. I won't talk more about that today. You see all of those things coming together in this idea of reinstating a hierarchical system that got overturned all the way back there in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act, but even before that in 1935 with the Social Security Act. Okay, you didn't come here for a history lecture, but that's a really important baseline to have, because what you see in the 1980s is the rise of that radical right in their takeover of the White House and Congress under Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan is the first president really to embrace this theory. And mind you, he does it more rhetorically than he does in real life. He actually governs very differently. This is why everybody can find a Ronald Reagan they like. He talks one way, he governs in a very different way. But he embraces these ideas. And this idea that the way that you create a good America again is to go back to the time before we had this new kind of government, back before 1935, is really part of his argument for, and again, I'm broad brushing this here, but part of the argument for the idea of getting rid of business regulation and getting rid of taxes. Remember all that emphasis on getting rid of taxes, because what Reagan and his people argue, and mind you, at the time, not a lot of people believe this, and that's, again, another rabbit hole I won't go into. You might remember George Bush the first talking about voodoo economics. What they argued was that if you got rid of business regulation and you got rid of taxes, what that would do is it would free up investment capital for investors, for those big businessmen, to pour back into the economy. And when it did that, they argued, what would happen was that everybody's lives would get better because the economy would grow so dramatically. And when that happened, you wouldn't need things like a social safety net, and private industry would invest in infrastructure. And you certainly wouldn't need business regulation because those people who had all this money would be investing it in businesses that work terrifically well. What they were essentially arguing was that the United States should go back to a fantasy version of the 1920s, which on paper, for a while, looked really good. But then, of course, it turned out that the benefits of the economic growth of the 1920s were not going widely throughout society. They were only going to a very small group of people. And as a result, you're going to see in October of 1929, the Great Crash. All right, so this was the idea. And what you have seen, though, is that from the very beginning in the 1980s, American voters didn't like this. They didn't like the deregulation. They didn't like the union busting. They didn't like the cuts to the social safety net and to education. And so in order to stay in power, that reactionary group of the Republican Party, because this is going to be very important, that this is not the original Republican Party or the Republican Party of the 20th century. This is a faction that's going to take it over, especially in the 1990s. What they began to do was to focus on the idea of concentrating power in the executive branch. And you see this under Ronald Reagan when his Attorney General, Edwin Meese, says, we're going to stack the courts so that no matter what voters do, we're going to be able to stay in power. And you see it in 1986 with the idea of ballot integrity. They're going to the Republicans are going to start to argue that the only way Democrats win office is by cheating. And so they say we've got to get rid of some of this Democratic voting. And you can see them trying to concentrate power with this very small group of people in the executive branch with a very strong president. And part of that, and part of staying in power to do that at a time when people really don't like what they're doing, is constantly to hammer on the idea that Black Americans and Brown Americans and women who want to work outside the home, and later on they're going to argue LGBTQ plus people, that those are individuals who are demanding tax dollars without deserving them. And that's a really important construction because you can see the constant dog whistles in the 1980s, but then by the 1990s, you're quite visibly going to get that coming much more to the surface in politics through things like the Willie Horton ad under George Bush in the election where he uses that hideously racist and misleading ad to try and turn white voters away from the Democrats by arguing falsely that it was Michael Dukakis, the Democratic nominee that year, who had let this murderer and rapist out. That wasn't actually at all what happened. But you see increasingly this focus on Black Americans, Brown Americans, and women who want to work outside the home as people who want something for nothing, as people who are socialists, as people who are, as Rush Limbaugh used to say, feminazis, as people who are embracing socialism or communism. And that focus on voters, telling their voters that they must stick with the Republicans and their tax cuts and their deregulation to create this system that is going to work for them, goes on for a couple of decades, a couple of generations even. And you end up in 2016 with the rise of Donald Trump, who very clearly turns that sort of uneasy marriage between the very wealthy businessmen who want tax cuts and deregulation to that marriage to the racism and the sexism and the homophobia of the base that they have created. So and then, I've talked about this before, how Trump actually gets rid of the establishment Republicans who have been uh, in power and basically courting that base without expecting to give them power. And he actually gives power to the base and so on. Now, the reason I gave you that very long history there was because if you have that background, an awful lot of what is going on right now makes a lot more sense.